welcome to our digital transport section. As Max has kindly introduced me, my name is Caroline Hildreth. I'm Vice Chair of ITS UK, and my normal day job is as Principal for Digital Roads at a company called Netcompany. So our transport network is the spine of the nation, but much of it was designed in an analogue age. Today we're going to be exploring in the digital transport section that digital revolution that's happening right now. We'll discuss how we're moving from concrete and steel to data and algorithms to create a transport system that really is smarter, is greener, more accessible, and more resilient. The question really isn't if we should be using this technology, but how can we harness it more effectively, ethically, and for the benefit of everyone? So I'm really honoured to be introducing our first keynote of the day. We're going to be joined by the newly appointed Chief Scientific Advisor, Patricia Thornley. She's also a professor at the Energy and Bioproducts Research Institute at Aston University, and she's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. So, Patricia.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Super, okay. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for inviting me here today. I am really excited to be here. I think this is week 4 for me as CSA, and this is my first proper outing, getting to talk to people. So this is really, really good. Caroline said, I've come up here from Aston University. I am an academic. I never planned on being an academic, and I've never taught students, so a strange academic. I've always focused on that interface between research and industry. I've done a lot of policy work over many decades. And for me, where you get or where you need change to happen, you've got to get those three working together. You've got to get academia working with industry, working with policy in order to get a positive space where we can move things forward. I did, once upon a time, do a PhD. I finished it in 1993, but it wasn't full of theoretical physics. It was a very applied industrial project on a big European project with lots of Spaniards and Germans, and my job was to go out and collect all the data on site and to bung it into a model. And that's what I am. I'm a modeler. I've spent decades working in the digital space, creating models of systems. And when you move from academia into industry, you get a reality check because you bring with you these beautiful models that you've created that give you answers, just like we've seen in the previous presentation. And then you encounter the real world. And at that point, you realize the limitations of modeling, and in particular, the limitations of sitting in front of a computer. Computer switches on, brain switches off. So I think it's really, really important that we have confidence in the digital futures that we are creating, the models that we are creating, the predictions that we are making by ground truthing them in reality. And to do that, we need connection through to the industry. We need to have confidence in the data that is in there and in what it is telling us. When I worked in the commercial sector before I was in academia, I also spent a lot of time working on big infrastructure projects. I used to do the site monitoring on behalf of the investors on construction projects. So I also know how hard it is to build large things, to build them on time, to build them to budget. And I know the reality of what you need to get into to make that happen. The fact that it's not just about the thing that you're doing. It's that interdisciplinary element. It's going on site and seeing the civils, the electricals, the digital pieces that all fit together. You need everything. I spent 12 years working at the University of Manchester, just down the road here. Actually, when I started here, I came to UMIST, the University of Manchester's Institute of Science and Technology, because I would never have wanted to have done anything as theoretical as what UOM was back then. I'm an applied person. I solve problems. And one of the things that I learned during those 12 years is the importance of interdisciplinarity, the importance of getting engineering solutions, but also bringing on board the social perspectives and the environmental impacts. That is not the bit that I am particularly good at, but I have colleagues who are, and I really recognise its importance. So integrating the social elements into our understanding of the transport system is really hard and really important. What I've spent most of my time in academia doing is working on sustainable fuels. So I've done a lot of work on everything from biofuels to, there is literally a report coming out from the Hydrogen Delivery Council today that I led on the environmental impact of hydrogen in systems. I've also worked on ammonia and other potential fuels. I do a lot of life cycle modelling. So I do a lot of looking upstream and looking at the whole system, working out what the engineering potential is, but also what the environmental and economic realities are. And that's sort of where I ended up in terms of why I'm now standing here as CSA on transport. Because if you look at the transport sector over the last 30 years in the UK, the carbon emissions have barely budged. Bar the impact that we had with COVID, we have not brought down carbon in transport. We've had lots of innovations, we've had lots of drop-in replacements, we've had lots of stuff going on, but it hasn't actually really made a difference. And I think that's because it's an incredibly complex system. We've got to deal with different modes, we've got to deal with different routes around the country, we've got to deal with the economics of all of that, but above all, we're also dealing with people. People make choices, and that is what ultimately drives the carbon emissions and reductions that we might want to see. One of the things that's also struck me over the last month or so, and it's early days on this, is I'm not getting a strong sense that we really understand what we're aiming for, what good looks like for transport in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, what the role of those different modes are, how we can push them to their maximum, and what that will look like for users and for the environment. So I got asked this morning what I wanted to do in the 3-year period that I'm appointed CSA. What would I like to see as a difference? I was slightly floored by that question because on week 4, I don't think I'd thought that far ahead yet, but I have been thinking about it in the last hour or so. And I think what I'd really like is for us to have a clearer vision in 3 years' time of what the future sustainable transport system looks like. And the reason we need to do that is this is a massive infrastructure. I think the need for change in that infrastructure is immense. And there are points within that of no return. There are points when early decision making can make better economic sense. There are efficiencies within that that we can think about. And if we don't do that far enough in advance, then we may end up with a more expensive system in the long run. So I think what I would like over the 3-year period is to focus on making the system more sustainable. And within that, to look particularly at what does the infrastructure supporting that need to look like, and how can that change really be delivered? Who's involved in that, and how can it happen? It's really good, and I did know before I came in the room today, but it's really good to hear that the ITS World Congress is in Birmingham in October 27th. So that's where I work at the moment, in Aston University, right in the centre of the city. Yes, I get the train into New Street Station every day. So I will look forward to seeing many of you in October 27, and maybe we can have a look then at how much more sustainable we've made the system in that, 18-month period or so until then, and see how we're progressing. Because if we can't progress in that sort of time scale, then we won't progress 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. We need to have those stage post gates where we look at things moving forward. So that's all I had to say. Hopefully that helps bring us back on time a little bit. Thank you.
So we are getting very close to the break, but I do think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Do you want to take a seat, Patricia? I'm struggling with the lights, but does anyone have any questions for Patricia?
Thank you, Patricia. I just wondered whether you could kind of highlight a couple of areas that you'd like to see really addressed over the next few years in terms of carbon emissions from transportation.
Okay, so if we look at roads, surface transport, what we've seen to date is us looking at drop-in solutions. We've put the renewable transport fuel obligation in place, which has let us get up to a very limited percentage. And one of the challenges here is if you look at the carbon savings that we get around the fuel itself, that can be 80–90%. But if you're only dropping it in to the tune of 10% of the volume of what you're producing, then we're really limited in terms of what we can achieve. I think we can probably go further in terms of renewable fuels, but I think the thing that we really want to be doing is accelerating the electric vehicle uptake. And this comes back to people choices as well. The reality is that people like them. They want to buy one, they want to have one. So making that, improving the rollout on that is important. I think that there's also an issue with, if we look at the wider infrastructure piece, that is what is effectively preventing us from moving forward on that. It's, you know, how you get that electrification charging system put in place in order to support where we want to be on that. Looking at freight and looking at the movement of lorries around the system and how we deal with those. I don't think that at the moment we have clear answers on what are the best solutions for the different sectors as we transition through, you know, in an economically sound way. Sorry, and I say that having spent most of the last period working in other areas in aviation and maritime and thinking actually the real problem is over here.
Hello, Darren Kaplan, Chief Executive of the Rail Industry Association, and thanks for your presentation, really interesting. Just want to challenge something. Just looking at the figures of carbon reduction, total reduction carbon emissions, as of 2023, emissions have fallen by approximately 53% compared to 1990 levels, significantly better than lots of other countries. Isn't there a case for making transport as an exceptional case, because we are cutting carbon in this country quite significantly, and transport is doing what it's best, whether it's rail or aviation or shipping, there's more plans afoot. What's the crisis in transport?
The crisis in the fact is that the figures you gave are correct. Yes, the carbon dioxide emissions overall. The transport sector has not reduced significantly. I think it has a scope to reduce. I think we can do more. I think we can do more with electrification. I think we can do more with alternative fuels, particularly on the aviation and maritime side of things. The important thing is not that every sector reduces, and I say this a lot. It's that we get to net zero across the entire planet. It's that we get to it from our commitments from the UK at the point in time when we need to balance this out. There will always be residual emissions. There will be residual emissions from land. There will be residual emissions from the fact that we all still exist and we're breathing and doing things as we go about our daily business. But we can deal with some of that with negative emissions. So yes, if we progress on other things, and if we progress on the CO2 capture side of things, then we can afford for transport to reduce less. But I think that we do need to look at this as part of an overall system. And the fact that electricity, in particular, has massively reduced its carbon footprint is an opportunity for transport in terms of using that more in order to deliver the carbon reductions.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much. My name's Dallas Delaney. I work at Transit App, so in journey planning space. You've talked a lot about electrification and this sort of Q&A portion, and also the people make choices, I think is obviously fantastic. What I want to ask about is how do you see mode shift factoring into the work that you do? Because obviously if people are choosing an electric vehicle over a petrol vehicle, that's fantastic. But if they're choosing to take the bus instead of a personal vehicle, then that's a whole different layer. So how does that sort of layer into your thinking right now?
I think that we have a pretty poor understanding of the role that that can play, to be honest. And that's one of the things that I meant when I said that I don't think we know what good looks like. I think some people from the West Midlands here, I can remember the first time that they told me that they were planning on doing hydrogen buses. And I said to the person I was talking to, I said, that's lovely, but I really wish you could focus on getting people onto the buses and, you know, let's get them fully occupied and moving and get them out of their cars before we start, you know, the difference that we will make in terms of carbon emissions by getting people onto public transport away from their current vehicles is immense compared to the differential that we then make by making that bus zero emission. So I think that we don't have a really good understanding of it, and I think one of the reasons for that is what I said earlier, that we don't understand what drives people's choices, and we're not very good at factoring that into our models and our decision making. You know, economic models will always work on what is the point at which this becomes the most cost competitive option. The reality is that I as an individual cannot be bothered to do the most cost competitive thing if it only saves me 1 pence a week. But at that point, the computer will tell me, oh, this wins. So I think we have to understand what motivates people and do more on the persuasion front. But I think that until we do that, you know, we've got a complex space which doesn't properly factor that in at the moment. Yes, we need mode shift, and understanding how we get that is a really big challenge.
Thank you. If I could invite you all to thank Patricia with me. It's been, really insightful. I know a big ask 4 weeks into the role. It must have been very daunting to come and have an opinion in front of the ITS membership. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.